Hey, thank you for joining me today. Have you ever felt that you try too hard to please other people? And have you heard about perfectionist personality patterns feeding into the types of people who get chronic illnesses and physical pain? In his work, Dr. Gabor Maté is presenting a theory that chronic stress and chronic trauma from early life cause us to develop certain personality traits, which then in turn create patterns of behavior that drive chronic symptoms and chronic illness. This is why I'm reading to you case studies so that you can learn and understand how neuroplasticity and your nervous system can work together to help you on your healing journey. Just a trigger warning, Dr. Gabor Maté's style of writing does mean that he goes into quite a lot of detail of chronic illnesses and symptom descriptions, and also sometimes when a diagnosis is terminal. Eventually, having unmet needs or having to meet the needs of others is no longer experienced as stressful. It feels normal. One is disarmed. Veronique is 33. She was diagnosed with MS 3 years ago. I had a major episode, she relates, which I didn't know was an episode. Pain in my feet, numbness and tingling going all the way up to the upper chest and then back down over about 3 days. I thought it was cool. I was poking myself and I couldn't feel anything. I didn't say anything to anybody. A friend finally convinced her to seek medical help. You had numbness and pain from your feet to your upper chest and you didn't tell anybody. Why is that? Asked Gabor Maté. I didn't think it was worth telling anybody. And if I told somebody, like my parents, they would be upset. But if someone else had numbness and pain from the feet up to the mid-chest, would you ignore it? No, I would rush him to the doctor. Why were you treating yourself worse than you would another person? Any idea? Asks Gabor Maté. No, she says. Most instructive is Veronique's response to the question about any possibly stressful experiences prior to the onset of her multiple sclerosis. Not necessarily bad things, she says. I'm an adopted child. Finally, after 15 years of pressure from my adoptive mum, I looked up my biological family, which I didn't want to do. But it's always easier to give in to my mum's demands than argue about it. Always. I found them and met them, and my very first impression was, ugh. We can't possibly be related. It was stressful for me to find out about my family history because I didn't need to know that I was possibly a child of incestuous rape. That's how it appears. Nobody's telling the whole story, and my biological mother won't say anything. Also, at that time, I was unemployed, waiting for EI on welfare. And I'd kicked out my boyfriend a few months before this because he was an alcoholic and I couldn't handle that anymore either. It wasn't worth my sanity. Such are the stresses this young woman describes as not necessarily bad. Ongoing pressure from her adoptive mother, who ignored Veronique's own wishes, to find and reunite with her dysfunctional biological family, discovering that her conception may have been the result of incestuous rape by a cousin. Veronique's biological mother was 16 at the time. Financial destitution, her breakup with an alcoholic boyfriend. Veronique identifies with her adoptive father. He's my hero, she says. He was always there for me. So why didn't you go to him for help when you felt pressured by your mother? Asks Gabor Maté. I could never get him alone. I always had to go through her to get to him. And what did your father do with all this? He just stood by, but I could tell he didn't like it. I'm glad you feel close to your dad, but you may wish to find yourself a new hero, one who can model some self-assertion. In order to heal, you may wish to become your own hero. In case you're new here, my name is Amari Love, and I'm a writer, a mind-body practitioner and somatic coach who recovered from decades of chronic illness and cancer. And now I share everything I learned here on this channel. I'm very glad this work has found you. And now let's get into reading the next part of this seminal book, When the Body Says No. Barbara, a psychotherapist, by reputation a highly effective one, treats many people with chronic illness. She herself has multiple sclerosis. She strenuously objects to the suggestion that repression originating in her childhood experience has anything to do with her plaques of inflammation and scarring at the root of her MS symptoms. Barbara's multiple sclerosis presented 18 years ago. The first symptoms erupted shortly after she invited a sociopathic man she had worked with at a correctional facility into her home for a 2-week stay. He had done a lot of therapy, she says, and the idea was to give him a fresh chance. Instead, the client caused havoc and disruption in her home and her marriage. I ask Barbara if she does not see this invitation to a seriously troubled person as having represented a major boundary problem on her part. I'll say, well, yes and no, she says. I thought it was fine because it was a 2-week deal, but I would never do it again, obviously. I'm so good on boundaries now that I have one client who calls me the boundary queen. And she's another therapist, so we joke about it. Unfortunately, I had to learn the hard way. Sometimes I think that my MS was a punishment for my foolishness. This reference to disease as punishment raises a key issue, since people with chronic illness are frequently accused, or may accuse themselves, of somehow deserving their misfortune. If the repression or stress perspective truly did imply that disease was punishment, I would agree with Barbara's rejection of it. But a search for scientific understanding is incompatible with moralizing and judgment. To say that an ill-advised decision to invite a potentially harmful person into one's home was a source of stress and played a role in the onset of illness is simply to point out a relationship between stress and disease. It is to discuss a possible consequence, not as punishment, but as physiological reality. Barbara insists she had nothing but a mutually loving and healthy relationship with her parents. My mother and I were great together. We were always very close. Boundaries are learned in our formative years, I say. So why did you have to learn boundaries later the hard way? I knew boundaries, but my mother did not. That's what most of our fights were about her inability to recognize where she ended and I began, says Barbara. Barbara's introduction of an unstable and dangerous man into her home would be defined in studies as a major stressor. But the chronic stress of poor boundaries that preceded it is not so easily identified. The blurring of psychological boundaries during childhood becomes a significant source of future physiological stress in the adult. There are ongoing negative effects on the body's hormonal and immune systems since people with indistinct personal boundaries live with stress. It is a permanent part of their daily experience to be encroached upon by others. However, that is a reality they have learned to exclude from direct awareness. The cause or causes of multiple sclerosis remain unknown, notes a respected textbook of internal medicine. Most research refutes a contagious origin, although a virus may possibly be indicated. There are probably genetic influences, since a few racial groups do seem to be free of it. For example, the Inuit in North America and the Bantus of Southern Africa. But genes do not explain who gets the disease or why. While it is possible to inherit a genetic susceptibility to MS, it is not possible to inherit the disease, writes the neurologist Louis J. Rosner, former head of the UCLA Multiple Sclerosis Clinic. And even people who have all the necessary genes do not necessarily get MS. The disease, experts believe, must be triggered by environmental factors. Complicating matters are MRI studies and autopsies that identify the characteristic signs of demyelination in the central nervous system of persons who never exhibited any overt signs or symptoms of the disease. Why is it that some people with these neuropathological findings escape the frank development of illness while others do not? What could be the environmental factors alluded to by Dr. Rosner? Dr. Rosner's otherwise excellent primer on multiple sclerosis summarily dismisses exploration of emotional stress as a contributing factor to the onset. Instead, he concludes that the disease is probably best explained by autoimmunity. A person becomes allergic to his own tissue, he explains, and produces antibodies that attack healthy cells. He ignores the abundant medical literature linking autoimmune processes themselves to stress and personality, a vital link to be explored more fully in later chapters of this book. A 1994 study done in the Department of Neurology at the University of Chicago Hospital looked at nervous system, immune system interactions, and their potential role in multiple sclerosis. Rats were used to demonstrate that artificially induced autoimmune disease would worsen when the fight or flight response was blocked. Had it not been interfered with, the animal's ability to respond normally to stress would have protected them. The MS patients described in the stress literature, and all the ones I interviewed, have been placed in positions akin to that of the unfortunate lab animals in that study. They were exposed to acute and chronic stress by their childhood conditioning, and their ability to engage in the necessary fight or flight behaviour was impaired. The fundamental problem is not the external stress, such as the life events quoted in the studies, but an environmentally conditioned helplessness that permits neither of the normal responses of fight or flight. The resulting internal stress becomes repressed and therefore invisible. Eventually, having unmet needs or having to meet the needs of others is no longer experienced as stressful. It feels normal. One is disarmed. One is disarmed because the stress is now hidden. It's so repressed we don't know it's there because it became normal from our early life behaviour patterns. This is groundbreaking. What he is saying here is so amazing. He is openly disagreeing with the head of the Multiple Sclerosis Institute, who said multiple sclerosis was most likely caused by autoimmune, by the cells of the body turning against their own tissues. And he excluded the possibility that emotional stress could be having an effect. And Gabor Maté is saying there is so much evidence to show that emotional stress, early life patterns are clearly driving this condition. I would love to hear your thoughts on what I'm reading. I would love to hear from you whether you have any kind of chronic condition or not, especially if you have multiple sclerosis or chronic fatigue syndrome or anything that might be being driven by hidden stressors, by personality traits. Is this something you've ever considered as a possible root cause to what you're suffering? I'm going to link for you to another practice on screen to help you with your nervous system healing today. Thank you for being here. It means a lot. Take good care of yourself now.